and welcome back. I'm here with Crystal Bollinger. How do you say that? I don't want to mess it up.
Ballinger.
Ballinger. See, I'm country. I tell you, I'm country. And so, as a licensed clinical social worker with what's the C? We talked about that.
Yes, LCSW, the state of Maryland, stands for Licensed Certified Social Worker, and the extra C is clinical, and that is what allows us to have a private practice, independent therapy, and things of that nature, and diagnose mental disorders.
Oh, okay, all right. So that's very different from the state of Florida. Florida, I think clinical social workers have to be within an agency setting.
Oh.
As opposed to independent. I'm not sure now, but I've been out retired for a while. So without further ado, we're gonna go ahead and let you have the stage.
Okay, well, thank you for this opportunity. Again, I am Crystal Tolson Ballinger, or simply Crystal Ballinger. And I have been a licensed social worker for over 20 years. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about child abuse, the long-term effects, psychological, that has been discussed previously, but there may be some of you who are just logging on, so this may be your first time hearing it. What I'm also going to talk about is child abuse and its effects on education, because I have also worked in schools continuously since 2001. Since AOL had chat rooms, that's how long I've been working in school systems. So without further ado, let me continue and talk about that. So I want to talk, I'm a storyteller, and so I'll start off with a story. So I was 27 years old when I made a career move that would change the trajectory of my life. I had decided I was tired of working in the foster care field, and I wanted to get away from so much abuse and neglect. So I decided that I would go work in the school system. And all of you out there who are educators got that joke, because there is so much abuse and neglect in the school system. And often educators are the people who are the first responders, the first one a child ever discloses to. So again, when I was 27, I took a job at RICA, which stands for Regional Institute of Children and Adolescents. And it was an RTC placement. Now, RTC is a residential treatment facility. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a psychiatric education facility where the students live at, because their disabilities are so great that they have to be contained in one environment in order to service their learning needs. So of course, we're talking about students who have a special education diagnosis, and the diagnosis is considered emotional disturbance. Emotional disability. My apologies. Every couple of years, the terminology changes, but now it's called emotional disability. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So students who have a type of emotional disability, it's because whatever trauma or abuse they have had impacts their ability to learn, to access the education. One of the things I'll talk about in a few moments is how trauma can affect the brain and how it can affect the frontal precortex, and how that affects impulse control and executive functioning. And that is what a child needs to be able to learn appropriately in school. But students who have that diagnosis not only have problems with learning, they have problems with interpersonal relationships, mood regulations, and things of that nature. So let me give you an example of some behaviors in a school where students might be diagnosed with emotional disturbance. So those, let me give you an example. So in a school like that, a teacher may ask a student, have you done your homework? And a student may have an over-the-top reaction. The student may throw the desk, start cursing, and accuse the teacher of bullying or picking on them. And the teacher's aware that this child is reacting out of proportion to the question that I asked. I asked about homework, but this child is responding as if there's something else I'm doing. Perhaps this child is reliving trauma, some previous trauma. So this is the environment that I chose to work in. And because I am a social worker, one of the things we do when students come into our settings is we do what's called a psychosocial assessment. That's really an intake form, which really kind of gives us history, background, things of that nature, any type of trauma, any type of arrest. We get a full picture of what the child has gone through. And what I noticed was a common factor when I was doing these intake assessments was how many students were telling me that they had child abuse or sexual abuse, which is child abuse, or neglect or things of that nature. And I thought to myself, like, holy cow, all these students are having a similar response. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, the lambs are still screaming for these children. And you may not have any idea what in the world I just said or what that means. So I'm going to tell you a little story. There was a movie way back in 1991 called The Silence of the Lambs. That was a movie with a FBI person who was interviewing a serial killer. And he asked her about a traumatic event in her life. And she had a traumatic event where she tried to save some lambs that were being slaughtered. And she wasn't successful. And she told the person she was interviewing about how she still wakes up at night hearing the lambs screaming in the dark. And I realized that our students at our school are still waking up at night hearing their lambs screaming in the dark, whether that is they're remembering child abuse, or maybe they're remembering their mother being beaten, which is also a form of abuse when you expose a child to domestic violence. Our children are still waking up hearing these things in the setting I was working in. And I tried to figure out how is it that I could assist them. So I said earlier that trauma and child abuse affect the prefrontal cortex, but it also affects a small area in your brain right back here called the amygdala. Now, we all have an amygdala, and we all have an amygdala. It's a fancy word, amygdala. And it really affects our fight or flight. So fight or flight is that sensation that you get when you encounter a bear in the woods and you need to fight to the death or run, okay? So it's very useful if you see a bear in the woods. But I started to realize that some of our students have an amygdala that's turned on all the time because our students were coming from homes where every day they went home, there was a bear waiting for them in the home in the form of an aggressive, abusive parent or sexual abuser. So their amygdala was being activated over and over again daily. And that has, studies have shown that has long-term effects when your adrenaline is pumping like that on a regular basis. And that also can predispose students to engage in risky behavior. So let me move on a little bit. Okay, so I'm talking a lot about education, and that's also because I've worked in schools for 20 years. I begin to realize that a lot of us social workers or teachers who work in this field, we're kind of like the frontline workers, okay? Bear with me, I'm using another metaphor. So, at an ambulance scene or a scene of an accident, the ambulance paramedic gets to see the child at a scene of an accident. Ambulance or paramedic sees the accident and the victim in their raw form before they've been kind of stabilized and moved to the hospital. And I find that happens a lot in the educational setting. A lot of times teachers are the first person or counselors are the first people that these children disclose to. I realized when I worked in foster care, I had already worked with children who had been identified as being abused and were getting help and services. But working in the school system, I'm working with students who haven't gotten any services and don't know what to do. Let me move on a little bit and talk about the adverse childhood experiences. So there is actually a form called the ACE test, or adverse childhood experiences. And with this, it's about 10 questions. And the questions ask things like, have you had a parent that died, or when you were a child, did your parents divorce? Were you a victim of sexual abuse or child abuse? Things of that nature. And studies have found, this was a study conducted by Kaiser in the 90s, the studies have found that the more points you have on your ACE trauma score, that it directly can affect your longevity of life. So if you have 4 or more points where you answered yes to, like perhaps maybe your mom was a victim of domestic violence, perhaps you were abused, perhaps a parent or somebody went to jail, then you'll have more points on this ACE scale. So what we find is that if you have been abused and you have not been properly treated, you're more likely to possibly engage in risky behaviors to cope with that pain. Perhaps maybe you'll start using substances, or perhaps you'll get into a relationship with somebody as a teenager that's also abusive. Perhaps you'll even drop out of school because the trauma is so great that you can't concentrate in school and you're acting out and getting repeatedly suspended. So a lot of times, just from that childhood trauma develops a pattern where someone can have all those things happen, possibly drop out of high school. If you drop out of high school, you're not going to get a high-paying job. If you don't get a high-paying job, then you probably will not work, will not live or reside in the most stable communities. And when you don't have good communities, you don't have good access to health care. So you see how 1 or 2 or 3 traumatic events, such as child abuse, can lead to further decisions and complications that can affect the health. It has been said that at least with women who have 4 or more scores on the ACE test live about 20 years less, or have about 20 years shaved off of their life, than perhaps those who only scored 1 or didn't score any points on the ACE test. Let me see, let me double check. Okay, let me continue. So we did talk about how some of their psychological long-term effects could be depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. We talked about earlier how it could lead to bulimia and substance abuse. Definitely cutting and self-injurious behavior. A lot of people don't look at promiscuity as reckless behavior, but that also can happen. I'm not sure if we spoke about suicide, but suicide becomes more prevalent when you have untreated child sexual abuse. So those are some of the things that can happen. I don't want to go too much in that because it was covered previously. I do want to talk about some of the factors that can affect how well you can recover from childhood sexual abuse. Some of those factors are the age of the onset. So if you were abused earlier in life, it's harder for you to recover. Who the relationship of the perpetrator is, for example, if it's a parent that's abusing you, or if it's a parent that's committing incest, that's a lot harder for you to recover from because of the relationship of the perpetrator than it is if it's the softball coach. Not diminishing that if you are abused by the softball coach that you will not have severe trauma, but can you imagine how much worse it is if the very person who provides love and care is the same person who is abusing you? And can you see how that is a setup to have domestic violence even later when you're older and you're dating, or if you're a child who had this happen? Because how can you really distinguish what love is supposed to look like if your only memories of love are intertwined with abuse and manipulation? It's just a setup. And a lot of people don't have a lot of healthy relationships without the right intervention. Also, other things that affect how a child recovers from the abuse is, we call those protective factors, like if they have at least one stable parent, or if they have a support system that can help them, perhaps even if it's not a family member, perhaps it's a school counselor. Things of this nature really help determine whether or not a child can recover well or successfully from this type of childhood abuse or trauma. Because what we don't want to do is have people who have been abused as children just have further re-victimization in their adult life. So let me also, I think because of time, I'm going to skip how we can have signs of child abuse or neglect. So I'm just going to say to that, if you see something, say something. And I know that that is a slogan that I think they have with terrorism or things like that. but child abuse is child terrorism. So if you even suspect that you know a child is being abused, it would be better to report it and find out later that there is no harm. A lot of times adults worry about, well, if I report and there is no abuse, it's going to ruin the parent's life. So your alliance is not with the adult. You are not to worry about how the adult will handle it. You need to think about how you can intervene and save a child's life. I'm going to move on to some other factors that we have not discussed. I'm going to talk about abuse and behavior when you are working with international students or families. I work at an international high school. As a matter of fact, I'll give a shout out. I work at the International High School in Largo, Maryland, and we have about 32 different languages and various cultures. And so keep in mind when you are working with students or families or just people in the community who are from different cultures, that what may be neglect and abuse in America may not be neglect and abuse in countries in Africa or countries in Asia or things of that nature. So you want to have the ability to ascertain whether or not this is cultural, or if the parent thinks they're helping versus the parent just doing things that you feel meet the definition of abuse or neglect. And so you may have to give them education about what's allowed in America. And then if they continue to do it anyway, then yes, you may have to realize that this parent is just going to continue this behavior, which in America is considered child abuse. But let me tell you for a couple things, like I work with students, I work with Asian American, Latino, African students who come from the continent of Africa. And a lot of Asian American parents do not feel that it's neglectful to work long hours and have the older children watch the younger children. They're not thinking that's neglectful, but we may be thinking, oh, well, the parent's not home until midnight and the 12-year-old's watching. So that's a cultural difference that you may have to take a look at and determine whether the parent intended neglect or if these are cultural differences. Also, a lot of our African and Asian families will lean on traditional healing methods versus, medicine. So like one practice is called cupping, where you use this hot cup and you put it on the back of the child, and it's supposed to, cure the child of a lot of ailments. But then the child's coming to school with a whole bunch of bright red marks on the back, which will look like abuse to us when the parent was trying to actually heal the child. So these are some things we have to be aware of. I work with students who are born in Africa and the Middle East, and a lot of them have had female circumcision. And while that is cultural in their countries, it is absolutely child abuse in the United States. And so we have to have some education about what can and cannot happen in the United States. Unfortunately, a lot of these families send their girls home over the summer to still have the procedure done. Let me think what else. Okay, let me drink some water just for a moment. I know in a lot of Latino cultures that there's a phenomenon, I'm gonna call it a phenomenon. It's called the chancla. A lot of Latino parents will take a flip-flop and hurl it at their child, and that is cultural, and it's not even looked at as abuse. But I mean, when you're getting reports of students who had a shoe to the eye, you may want to report that and may want to have a conversation with the parent about what is and what is not acceptable. Now, when you're working with a lot of students who may be undocumented, they may be very reluctant to tell you about abuse because they're fearful of how it could affect immigration status or their parents' immigration status or things of that nature. And also language could be a barrier. It's very hard for a child to tell you what's going on if they can't communicate with you, and if they come from a culture where talking about family business is shameful. You should also know that when you're working with students who are from the Middle East and Africa, where virginity is highly prized, that it is possible that they may not want to disclose any sexual abuse to you because the idea of the world knowing that their daughter is not a virgin is so shameful that they'd rather keep that as a family secret, and therefore that child doesn't get the treatment that he or she needs. And I also want to talk about the Black community, okay? So in the Black community, there's a quote that I heard over and over again. It goes, "Spare the rod." I bet the rest of y'all finished that. It goes, spare the rod and spoil the child, which is what a lot of parents use to justify physically beating their children. And it's amazing how we can take scriptures from the Bible and utilize them for different purposes. But the Black community, we have to realize that some of the spanking is flat out abuse. And when it's time for the child to get help from being abused, a lot of Black families are reluctant to go to therapy. They maybe want to talk to the pastor, let the church deal with it. And I say, let your pastor talk to them and let the therapist talk to the child too. God did make therapists, so let's utilize them. And so it's a lot of stigma about reaching out for mental health and things like that. And we have to dispel all those notions in the community. And I just want to end, I think I may be over time. I just want to end with one statement. If you have a child that has been sexually abused, and as a parent or guardian, you do not want that child to get assistance or get therapy, I want to let you know that you have possibly shortened the life expectancy of your child by 20 years. That's very harsh, but I want you to understand that is how deeply the abuse affects children if it's untreated. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a very informative session, Krista. I have a couple of questions. Let me check with the audience and see if they have any questions. Okay, one question from Mr. William Hill is, what, if any, are the differences between child abuse and parental corporal punishment, such as spankings and popping your child, from the legal standpoint?
Okay, thank you for that question. And because most of my practice has been in the state of Maryland, I have to give Maryland's law. So in Maryland, you are allowed to spank your child with an open hand. Okay, most people scoff at that, but you're allowed to use an open hand. But in Maryland, the moment you pick up a coat hanger or a belt or anything of that nature, then we're crossing over into abuse. But the very definition is injury. You can discipline your child, but if you leave a mark, that is considered an injury. And it doesn't take long or much force to leave a mark on a child. So it will be better to try to use different ways to discipline than to go straight to spanking.
You see me laughing, right? Because listen, I'm 60 years old, and I can tell you some horror stories where I guarantee you 3/4 of the hood I grew up in, they would be in prison, because kids getting beat with fan belts, Hot Wheel tracks, okay, a stick, anything that was within reach, being sent to the yard to cut out your own switch.
That's what you try to get the lighter branch so that it doesn't hurt as much. You get the smallest stick and they send you back out to get a thicker one. Correct.
Or get two more and they plat it together.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing. So we have to understand, as professionals, one of the things that I had to quickly adjust was the cultural aspect of what we see parents do. And a lot of it is miseducation. Remember, the older generation, my mom came from a time where, as a little boy, I had to go to the back of the bus with her. Okay? So many parents grew up in that era of believing that it's better that they beat you than white people get a hold of you and beat you or possibly murder you for something. So I think that was the onus on using corporal punishment during that time. But as a society, we only came into really child development in the early 50s, where we began to see children as separate from what adults. We always thought of them as little adults. If they could walk and talk, we could converse. So are you still seeing some of those attitudes that are prevalent in the population you serve?
Repeat the sentence right before that again.
I'm saying, are you still seeing some of those mindsets and beliefs still perpetuated on the population that you serve? Are the parents still having that mindset about, I got to spank you before you get in trouble?
Yeah. Well, okay. No, not before white people get to you. Not that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that part has been removed. But the fact that the parents feel like, I want to teach you before the cops get you, or anyone else.
Well, now that is white people, because, and Veronica will tell you, I'm the dude that will go there, okay? Because we have to understand the psychological realm in which we dwell. You have to remember that for many African Americans, the police are a representation of the white power structure and white supremacy in this country. We have to acknowledge that. We really do. We have to call a frog a frog. So it is still very much, we are afraid of what white people will do to us if we act up. So we're still teaching our children based in that untruth, so to speak. And we have to, one of the things I believe in sunlight being shown on stuff, because we'll remain ignorant. If we dismiss it and we don't call it what it is, we'll never get past it. We'll never outgrow it. We'll never reconcile that. Many of us, think about it. We're still having a talk. I had to talk about what to do in front of white policemen, how to act in front of white people. Okay. I had that talk from my mom, my grandmother, and all my aunts. Okay. We are still perpetuating that because it's necessary for our survival. Okay. I'm not saying that all white people are the cause of that, but enough of it still exists where we need to caution our kids about how they behave in deference to other people.
I'm glad you broke it down like that, because when you first said it, I was thinking more a different route, like white segregation and white bathrooms. But you're absolutely right when you broke it down like that.
Yeah. So we still have to. I do this, and it's one of the things that my wife and I now, we teach life classes, and we talk about social obligation and social responsibility. What is your role in raising a child to be a socially conscious and responsible citizen? Because that does fall on the parent. We've got to teach our children that they have a certain role to play in society. We can't back up from that. And I think that in our community, we fail them often. We don't teach them conflict resolution, okay? And how and we saw that I think that was part of the equation with the police shooting that young woman the other day. There were so many pathways she could have chosen had she been taught how to resolve, how to de-escalate, how to avoid conflict with people. She could have went back in the house, okay? And I relate that to me growing up, and I understand that. Go ahead, Veronica.
I agree with what both of you are saying. I just want to piggyback on, let's keep the conversation going about child abuse prevention and awareness. I do believe this is a black, white, blue, green, purple issue. It's not just, and I'm not saying that you're saying, I think this is a human issue that we're having, that we need to teach these principles on how to resolve things. With that being said, I come from a Christian background and still a professing Christian, like I said, blood ball. And I think what we have done is that spare the rod, spare the child. We've taken that to the extreme. Growing up, I got beat with lemon bushes with the spikes, twisted. I got beat with extension cords that literally ripped my skin apart, where I had to sometimes stay home from school because of that. They didn't do it because they hated me. They did that to spare the rod, spare the child. But what they didn't realize is that they were killing me on the inside. Terry, you may remember Dr. Belite. We attended a church in Orlando. One of my friends and her husband got arrested for abusing their
right.
kids. I literally saw the kids with my own eyes, marks all over their face. They were mixed kids, so you couldn't really hide the scars. I personally went to her and I asked her one day at church on a Sunday, What are you doing with these kids? But I could tell there's something wrong with these beautiful kids because their eyes was dead. There was nothing in their eyes. She says to me, I do what the Bible says do. I spare the rod. I don't spare the rod. I beat this kid. I withhold food from this kid. It was all over the news. Terry, you remember this couple?
Yeah. I actually went to school with the husband.
In their hearts, their heart of heart, even they stood on stage or at the courthouse and said, we are following the Bible. So you define, when is it abuse? I know that the beatings with the extension cords, with the rubbers and the sand dispersal sticks, that was abuse. But I don't think they really thought it was abuse back then.
Well, they didn't, but that speaks to the level of being that uninformed. We didn't know the things that we know now about child development. A lot of people did. And you're right. It's not just a Black issue, but that's primarily the population I serve. But I've done all populations. But I can tell you there are cultural aspects that make the impact much different. And I know that Crystal probably sees that in her line of work, that there are cultural variations on all of these groups. And what is abuse to one group may not be abuse to another group, but it's all abuse because it creates harm. So again, thank you, Crystal. We're going to jump ahead and go ahead to the next session. I don't see any more questions, so we're going to go ahead and log out here, and we're going to go to the next session. We're going to have Miss Precious Hill, and we're going to interview this young lady. Very powerful testimony she wants to share and information she wants to share, her insight into growing up as the daughter of Veronica Neely Morris. Yeah, I'm going to put you out there. So we'll be right back with that session.